So, David, I hear a lot about formulation, and I think, I'd really like to know in your own words, how would you define formulation?
Well, I think a formulation is just a story that explains why a young person has got the particular problems they have at that moment. And then it sort of identifies a way forward and helps the therapist or clinician or practitioner to work out what's likely to be helpful. So it's nothing more fancy than that.
I think sometimes, when we hear that word, I know as a practitioner, I can feel a bit like, oh gosh, that feels a bit formal, or, what would that mean? And the clinical guide, I think, refers to the 5 Ps, and sometimes it can be a bit, what's all that about? So how can we I just wonder, how can we move forward from that kind of thinking and, talk more a little bit about what those 5 Ps are?
Well, the first thing to say is that lots of people are already doing formulations. They just don't call it a formulation. Anyone that stops and thinks, what's going on for this young person and what can I do to help? Well, that's a formulation right there. It's just that we don't call it that. And what I think we're trying to encourage people to do in the guide is to just slow that process down and do it a bit better and give it a bit of time. So rather than just rushing in going, which child is this? What's going on with them? And what am I going to do? Thinking, okay, this is, so for example, from the animation Wesley, this is the problem, this is what's going on, and therefore this is what I'm likely to do that's likely to be helpful. Because I think if we help people to do it in a structured and systematic way, they don't miss things. They don't just assume they know what they're going to do. They're actually able to tailor their intervention more specifically to that particular young person in front of them. Those of us working with bereaved children know that every child reacts in a very different way. So really, formulation is a way of mapping out what's going on for them and why, and therefore mapping our intervention on to those particular difficulties. Yeah. And you mentioned those 5 Ps, so that's one way of doing it. It's quite a nice, simple way to just structure the information really and to think about what's going on. So the first P would be predisposing. So what's gone on for that person before their bereavement that actually might be playing a role in their current difficulties. Then we have precipitating. So what is it that's triggered this particular reaction? And obviously, in the cases we're talking about a bereavement. But what was the bereavement and how did the person die? What is it about the way the person died that is triggering these particular difficulties? The next P is problem. So as we know, for young people who are bereaved, they have a full range of difficulties. It's very difficult to pin it down to just one thing. So this particular young person, what is their particular problem? What is it that they're presenting with? What is it that they want to change? The next P is perpetuating. So what is it that's keeping these problems going? When we think about traumatic bereavement, we're thinking about a grief reaction that isn't naturally responding, isn't doing what it would normally do, and the young person isn't adjusting to their loss over the time. Actually, the difficulties are continuing. So what is it that's keeping those difficulties going? And then the last P is protective. So what have they got going for them? What are their strengths that we can really build on? So that's those 5 Ps. That's not the only way to do a formulation, but it's not a bad place to start. It's a nice way to structure the information gathering and to think, how do these different bits kind of interact with each other? Therefore, what can I do to try and help this young person?
Yeah, I think it's so helpful to kind of reiterate that message that we're probably already doing it in a less structured way anyway. Of course we are. We're already, before we go into that session, even if it's that quick kind of thinking, like, what's the purpose of this activity I'm going to do? What am I actually trying to accomplish with this young person? So I think it's really reassuring to not feel like it's this real formal process necessarily, but there's real value, which I know we'll talk about in a moment, about like the value of actually taking some time to do a formulation.
And another thing that's worth saying is that it's not kind of set in stone. It's not like you do a formulation the first time you meet the person and that's it. You kind of stick to that rigidly. Far from it. It's a flexible process that should change over time. As you get more information, as you get to know the young person more, you can actually change it. You can add more information. And we might get them wrong sometimes, and that's okay. Then we can redo it and put it back together and see what it is that's going on.
I think I'm interested, I guess, to talk about maybe a little bit about why it's so important to do. And we've already kind of touched on that a little bit, but it is about maybe not missing that information potentially and revisiting, like, as more information, as more data comes to you. So why else, I wonder,
Well, I think one of the reasons for doing a formulation is it's a very collaborative process, in fact. If you go to your GP and you tell them what the problem is, and you don't want them to just give you some medicine and send you away. You want them to explain what it is that's going on, and therefore how that medicine is going to help. And it's the same with our work. When a young person comes to us and they've got a problem that they want our help with, we don't just tell them what to do and expect them to go off and do it. We explain what we think is going on, so we can say, well, this is what's going on, this is why we think it might be, and therefore this is what might be useful. And the great thing about that process is they can then tell you how accurate your formulation is. They might say, well, actually, I'm not sure I agree with that, and they can contribute to it. So it becomes very much a collaborative process. So I think that's another really good reason for doing it.
And I think I've heard you say before, David, that if that young person was to ask you at the end of a session, or even as you're about to do an activity, like, why are we doing this? Would we be able to answer that? And that's exactly why there's so much value in kind of coming in with some formulation and taking that time to have a bit more of a structured kind of approach. Yeah,
absolutely. I think increasingly young people and families are quite rightly becoming more assertive in their rights, and they are asking these questions. Gone are the days where you just trust the person and do what they say. Quite rightly, people are saying, well, why? Why do we think this is a good idea? Why do I want to do a memory jar? I'm missing my maths lesson at the moment and I want to do one in my GCSEs. Why do you think doing this memory jar is going to be helpful? And I think we need to be able to answer that question. And more than, I just feel it's going to be helpful or it's helped other people. It's got to be better than that. We've got to explain to that young person what it is that's going on for them, and therefore what role building a memory jar is going to play in us helping them to adjust to their loss.
Yeah. And I think as you were talking there, I thought, there's so much value as a practitioner to actually go through that process as well, to hone your own skills and to actually have that rationale as to why you're choosing and to be able to articulate that, because sometimes it can feel quite instinctual to just feel like, yes, that feels like the right thing for this particular person at this particular time, but why? And so this formulation process can really break that down, I think, quite easily if you really stop and think about it.